Cowboy Silent Virtue. Madeline Sullivan had promised herself she'd never trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Rhett Lawson, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low and knowing. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 1. A Broken Vow in Dusty Winds. The wind howled a mournful ballad, whipping Madeline Sullivan's skirts around her ankles as she wrestled with the broken wagon wheel. Dust devils danced across the parched landscape, mocking her futile efforts. The sun, a merciless eye in the vast, bleached sky, beat down on her, turning her skin to leather and her throat to sandpaper. "Damn this forsaken land," she muttered, the words raspy and lost in the wind's ceaseless moan. She'd sworn off curses, just as she'd sworn off men, but the desert had a way of stripping a person bare, leaving only raw desperation. Madeline, at 58, was no stranger to hardship. Life on the frontier had taught her resilience, had etched lines of endurance around her kind, gray eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. But the betrayal that had driven her from her ranch, the Circle S, 3 months ago, had left a wound deeper than any branding iron. Her husband, Thomas, a man she'd loved with a naive and unwavering devotion for 30 years, had gambled away their livelihood, their future, on a crooked card game in a smoky backroom in Abilene. He'd then vanished into the night, leaving her with nothing but a crumbling reputation and a wagon load of regrets. She kicked at the stubborn wheel, the wood splintered and unyielding. Tears, hot and unwelcome, pricked at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. Crying wouldn't fix the wheel, wouldn't bring back Thomas, wouldn't mend the shattered pieces of her life. Only she could do that. And she would. She had to. She had promised herself, on the cold ashes of her former life, that she would build anew. She would find a small plot of land, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the judging eyes and whispering tongues of Abilene. Somewhere she could breathe again. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry echoing her own internal scream of frustration. She sank to her knees, the rough, dry earth scraping against her calloused hands. For the first time since leaving Abilene, she felt the crushing weight of her solitude. There was no one to help, no one to lean on. Just the endless expanse of sky and the unforgiving land, stretching out before her like a cruel joke. A shadow fell over her, long and lean. Madeline stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, pearl-handled pistol she kept tucked in her waistband. It was a lady's gun, more for show than serious defense, but it was all she had. She slowly raised her head, squinting against the harsh sunlight. A man stood there, silhouetted against the blazing sky. He was tall, a figure carved from the very landscape itself, his features obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He sat astride a magnificent chestnut stallion, the horse's coat gleaming like polished copper in the sun. The man wore dusty, well-worn leathers, a gun belt slung low on his hips, the butt of a Colt Peacemaker gleaming ominously. He was the epitome of the dangerous, untamed West, the kind of man she'd vowed to avoid. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply watched her, his presence a silent, unsettling weight in the vast emptiness. Madeline felt a prickle of fear, a familiar tightening in her chest. She'd learned the hard way that men, especially those who looked like they'd stepped out of a dime novel, were rarely what they seemed. Finally, he shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "Trouble, ma'am?" Madeline swallowed, trying to moisten her parched throat. "Broken wheel," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He dismounted in a fluid, graceful movement that belied his rugged appearance. He approached her slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. As he drew closer, she could see his face. It was a face that had seen its share of hardship, etched with lines of sun and wind and something darker, something that hinted at a past he wasn't eager to share. His eyes, though, were the most striking feature. They were a deep, piercing blue, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They held a strange mixture of weariness and intensity, a look that both unsettled and intrigued her. He knelt beside the broken wheel, his gaze assessing the damage. He didn't look at her, didn't offer any empty platitudes. He simply examined the splintered wood, his fingers tracing the cracks with a surprising gentleness. "Can't be fixed," he said finally, his voice still low. "You'll need a new one." Madeline's heart sank. A new wheel. That meant finding a town, finding a blacksmith, finding money she didn't have. It meant delays, complications, and the very real possibility of being stranded out here, alone and vulnerable. "I don't know where the nearest town is," she admitted, hating the tremor in her voice. He finally looked at her, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in his gaze, no condescension. Only a quiet assessment, a weighing of her situation. "Silver Creek," he said. "About 2 days' ride east. But you won't make it with that wagon." 2 days. An eternity in this unforgiving land. Madeline felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was trapped. Trapped by the broken wheel, by the vastness of the desert, by her own foolish pride that had led her to believe she could do this alone. He stood up, brushing the dust from his chaps. He looked at her again, his gaze lingering on her face, taking in the lines of worry, the exhaustion in her eyes. "I could take you," he said, the words seemingly pulled from him against his will. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. Trust a stranger? A gunfighter? Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. But what choice did she have? She looked at the broken wheel, at the endless horizon, at the hawk still circling overhead. She was utterly alone, and she was running out of time. The broken vow felt heavy in her heart, but necessity has a way of eroding even the strongest of promises. He smelled of leather and horses, and something else, something wild and untamed. It was a dangerous scent, a scent she should have run from. I don't know your name," she said, the words a fragile whisper in the wind. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "Rhett," he said finally. "Rhett Lawson." And the way he added his last name held the weight of the world behind its 2 syllables. Chapter 2. The gunfighter's shadowed gaze. Rhett Lawson. The name rolled off her tongue like a smooth, worn stone, its familiarity unsettling despite its newness. It sounded like a name whispered in hushed tones around campfires, a name associated with both respect and fear. Madeline watched him, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Gratitude warred with apprehension, hope battled with ingrained distrust. She'd spent a lifetime learning to read people, to decipher the subtle cues that betrayed their true nature. But Rhett Lawson was an enigma, a closed book written in a language she didn't understand. He stood there, patiently waiting for her answer, the setting sun casting long shadows that stretched and distorted his already imposing figure. The wind had picked up, whipping strands of her graying hair across her face, blurring her vision. She brushed them away, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice still shaky, but gaining a sliver of strength. "But I wouldn't want to impose." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips, a fleeting expression that did little to soften the harsh lines of his face. "Impose?" he repeated, his voice a low rumble. "Ma'am, you're stranded in the middle of nowhere with a broken wagon. I reckon impose ain't the word for it." His blunt honesty, while unsettling, was also strangely reassuring. He wasn't offering flowery words or false reassurances. He was simply stating a fact, a truth she couldn't deny. She looked at the wagon, at the meager supplies she'd managed to salvage from the Circle S, enough to last her a few weeks, perhaps, if she rationed carefully. But water was already running low, and the thought of being stranded out here, alone, with the vultures circling overhead, she shuddered. "I have some money," she said, reaching for the small pouch she kept hidden beneath her skirts. "I can pay you for your trouble." His blue eyes darkened, a flicker of something that might have been annoyance crossing his features. "Keep your money, ma'am," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "I ain't offering charity. I'm offering a ride." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. He wasn't doing this out of the kindness of his heart. There was something else, some other reason behind his offer. A reason she couldn't quite fathom. She hesitated, her gaze searching his face, trying to penetrate the mask of stoicism he wore. She saw weariness there, a deep-seated exhaustion that mirrored her own. She saw the lines etched by hardship, the shadows that hinted at a past filled with pain. But she also saw something else, something that surprised her. A flicker of vulnerability, a hint of loneliness that resonated with the hollowness in her own heart. It was that, more than anything, that made her decision. She was tired of being alone, tired of fighting a battle she couldn't win on her own. She needed help, even if it came from a stranger, a gunfighter with a shadowed past. "All right, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice firm now, the decision made. "I accept your offer, but I'll be paying my own way. I won't be a burden." He nodded, a curt gesture that acknowledged her acceptance. "We leave at first light," he said. "Get your things together. Only what you need. The stallion can't carry much." He turned and walked back to his horse, his movements economical and efficient. He unsaddled the magnificent animal, talking to it in low, soothing tones. Madeline watched him, mesmerized by the way he moved, the way he interacted with the horse. There was a gentleness there, a tenderness that contradicted the harshness of his appearance. She turned back to the wagon, her mind racing. What had she done? She'd just agreed to travel with a complete stranger, a man who could very well be a dangerous outlaw. She was putting her life, her future, in his hands. It was madness. And yet, she felt a strange sense of relief, a lifting of the burden she'd been carrying for so long. She began to gather her belongings, carefully selecting only the essentials. A few changes of clothes, her worn Bible, a small, framed photograph of her and Thomas, taken years ago, when they were young and hopeful and deeply in love. She hesitated over the photograph, her fingers tracing the faded image of her husband's smiling face. A wave of grief washed over her, sharp and unexpected. She'd thought she'd buried her feelings for him, buried them under layers of anger and resentment. But the pain was still there, a dull ache in her heart. She had a dream of starting a small garden. The seeds were in her bag, a foolish dream, perhaps. She tucked the photograph into her bag, along with the other items. She wouldn't forget Thomas, wouldn't forget the life they'd shared. But she wouldn't let the past define her future. She would move forward, one step at a time, even if it meant walking beside a gunfighter with a shadowed gaze. She had to. She owed that much to herself and her resolve not to let the actions of a foolish man break the spirit of a strong woman. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and red. The air was cooling, a welcome relief from the scorching heat of the day. She walked over the rise, spotting Rhett and his horse near a small copse of scrub brush. As she neared, he looked up. His eyes held a question, and for a split second, something else flickered there. Something she dared not name. Chapter 3. Campfire Confessions Under a Starry Sky. Rhett had built a small fire, the flames crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks and scrub brush. The aroma of burning mesquite filled the air, a scent both familiar and comforting. He'd already unsaddled his horse, allowing the animal to graze on the sparse vegetation. He was kneeling by the fire, tending to a small pot that hung suspended over the flames. Madeline approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability, of the fact that she was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew. A man who carried a gun and wore it with an ease that suggested he knew how to use it. He glanced up as she approached, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Supper's almost ready," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the crackling of the flames. "Supper?" Madeline repeated, surprised. She hadn't expected him to offer her food, let alone cook for her. He nodded, gesturing towards the pot. "Rabbit stew," he said. "Not fancy, but it'll fill your belly." Madeline's stomach rumbled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early that morning. She hesitated, unsure whether to accept his offer. It felt too intimate, sharing a meal with this stranger. But her hunger, and the undeniable warmth of the fire, overcame her reluctance. She sat down on a nearby rock, keeping a respectful distance between them. He served her a portion of the stew in a tin cup, handing it to her with a wooden spoon. The stew was surprisingly good, rich and flavorful, a testament to his unexpected culinary skills. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire, the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance, and the soft clinking of their spoons against the tin cups. The silence, though, wasn't awkward. It was comfortable in a strange way. It felt like a shared understanding, a recognition of the unspoken bond that had formed between them, born out of necessity and circumstance. The stars had begun to appear, a million tiny pinpricks of light in the vast, inky blackness of the night sky. Madeline looked up, mesmerized by the sheer beauty of it. She'd always loved the stars, loved the way they made her feel small and insignificant, yet somehow connected to something larger than herself. "Beautiful, ain't it?" Rhett said, his voice soft, almost reverent. He was looking up at the stars too, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Yes," Madeline agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "It makes you realize how small we are." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the heavens. "Small and insignificant," he repeated. "But not powerless." His words struck a chord within her. She thought of her own life, of the way she'd felt powerless in the face of Thomas's betrayal. But she wasn't powerless. She'd made a choice to leave, to start over. And she was still making choices, every day, every moment. "What made you come out here?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She was curious about him, about the life that had led him to this desolate place. He turned his gaze from the stars to her, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. "Running," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Running from what?" Madeline pressed, her curiosity piqued. He shrugged, a dismissive gesture that didn't quite mask the underlying tension in his body. "The past," he said. "Ghosts." She understood that. She was running from ghosts too. The ghost of her marriage, the ghost of her former life, the ghost of the woman she used to be. "We all have ghosts," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her own hidden secrets. "Some ghosts are harder to outrun than others," he said finally, his voice a low murmur. A comfortable silence settled between them, and the fire began to die down, its embers a fading reflection of the starlight above. I was married for 30 years, Madeline began, deciding in this crucible of a new beginning that honesty was a necessity for her own soul. He listened, intently, and she felt the first tendril of trust wrapping between them. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the careful pause, the honesty in his silence. She was unburdening, and he was a stoic port in her storm. He didn't judge, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened. He nodded slowly. "And you left him because he bet it all, and he lost," he said, the question implicit in his tone. "Yes," she replied, "and he left with the dawn, the coward." He remained silent for a good long while, before quietly feeding another branch into the embers. The fire rekindled, and with it, so did his gaze upon her. "Some burdens are too great to be carried alone, Madeline," he said, the use of her name both startling and surprisingly comforting. "Even out here." He reached out, and for a terrifying moment, Madeline flinched. But his hand simply fell upon hers, a light, brief touch, full of a warmth that spoke of more than just the firelight. The gesture surprised her, shocked her to the very core. It was the first time in a long time that she'd felt the touch of another human being, a touch that wasn't filled with expectation or demand. It was simply there, a fleeting connection in the vast, lonely darkness. The night had grown chilly, the fire dying once again, yet a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames now coursed through her. It was then, gazing into the dancing shadows and the dying embers, that she noticed the small, worn leather-bound book tucked into his saddlebag. It peeked out, almost shyly. What secrets did that hold, she wondered. Chapter 4. Fear and warmth in the bitter night. The touch, fleeting as it was, had sent a shiver through Madeline, a complex mix of fear and something else, something she hadn't felt in years. A spark. She quickly pulled her hand away, tucking it into her lap, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt exposed, vulnerable, under his steady gaze. Rhett didn't react, didn't comment on her withdrawal. He simply withdrew his own hand, his expression unreadable in the fading firelight. He added a few more pieces of wood to the embers, coaxing the flames back to life. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Madeline wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the growing chill of the night. The desert air, which had been scorching during the day, was now surprisingly cold. She shivered, her thin dress offering little protection against the elements. Rhett noticed, his gaze softening slightly. He stood up and walked over to his saddlebags, rummaging through them for a moment. He returned with a thick, wool blanket, its colors faded and worn, but undeniably warm. He offered it to her, his eyes avoiding hers. "Take it," he said, his voice gruff. "You'll freeze without it." Madeline hesitated, her pride warring with her need for warmth. She didn't want to be indebted to him, didn't want to appear weak. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and she knew she wouldn't last the night without some protection. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the blanket. She wrapped it around herself, the rough wool scratching against her skin, but the warmth it provided was immediate and welcome. He nodded, returning to his spot by the fire. He sat there, staring into the flames, his profile a silhouette against the flickering light. He seemed lost in thought, his mind miles away. Madeline studied him, her gaze tracing the lines of his face, the strong jaw, the high cheekbones, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was a handsome man, in a rugged, weathered sort of way. But it was more than his physical appearance that drew her attention. It was the sense of mystery that surrounded him, the air of quiet intensity, the hint of sadness that lingered in his eyes. She wondered about his past, about the ghosts he was running from. What had happened to him to make him so guarded, so wary of human connection? She longed to ask him, to delve into the secrets he held so tightly, but she knew it was too soon. She had to earn his trust, to prove to him that she wasn't a threat. The fire began to die down again, the flames shrinking, the embers glowing a dull red. The night had grown profoundly silent, the vastness of the desert pressing in on them. Madeline felt a sudden wave of loneliness, a feeling so intense it almost took her breath away. She'd been alone for so long, emotionally isolated even when she was surrounded by people. Thomas's betrayal had only deepened that sense of isolation, had reinforced her belief that she was better off alone. But sitting here, across the dying fire from this enigmatic gunfighter, she realized that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she thought. Perhaps there was still a possibility of connection, of finding someone who understood the burden she carried. Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She immediately regretted her question, fearing it was too personal, too revealing. Rhett turned his head, his blue eyes meeting hers. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching, probing. "Everyone gets lonely," he said finally, his voice low and raspy. "Even out here." His answer, simple as it was, resonated with her. It was an acknowledgement of their shared humanity, a recognition of the fundamental human need for connection. He shifted, turning his body to face her more fully. "What about you?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "Do you ever get lonely?" Madeline looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket between her fingers. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "All the time." He didn't say anything, didn't offer any empty platitudes. He simply held her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a depth of understanding that surprised her. It was as if he could see straight through her, see the pain and loneliness she'd tried so hard to hide. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of earlier. It was a silence filled with unspoken emotions, with a growing sense of connection, with the fragile beginnings of trust. The warmth of the blanket was nothing compared to the warmth that began to spread through her, as she realized that perhaps she was no longer alone in the big, unforgiving landscape. As she looked into his eyes, she saw the reflection of the small, dying embers. But beyond that, she saw something else. A flicker of vulnerability. A hint of yearning. And for the first time since meeting Rhett Lawson, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. A small, fragile bud of hope, pushing its way through the barren soil of her heart. What would tomorrow bring? She couldn't guess, but tonight there was inexplicably warmth. Chapter 5. Echoes of betrayal in the silent dawn. The dawn arrived not with a gentle caress, but with a stark, uncompromising light that painted the desert in shades of gray and pale gold. Madeline awoke stiff and sore, the wool blanket wrapped tightly around her. The fire had long since died, leaving only a pile of cold ashes. Rhett was already up, his horse saddled and ready to go. He was standing a short distance away, staring out at the horizon, his back to her. He was a silhouette against the rising sun, a tall, lean figure that seemed to embody the ruggedness of the landscape. He looked solitary, even in her presence. Madeline felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Pity? Empathy? Or something more, a nascent connection that both intrigued and frightened her. She sat up, brushing the dust and sand from her clothes. The night had been cold, but the blanket Rhett had given her had kept her surprisingly warm. More than that, though, it had provided a sense of comfort, a feeling of being cared for, even by a stranger. He turned as she moved, his blue eyes meeting hers. He didn't smile, didn't offer any greeting. He simply looked at her, his gaze assessing, searching. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the stillness of the morning. Madeline nodded, gathering her meager belongings. She felt a strange reluctance to leave this place, this temporary sanctuary. She'd shared a moment of vulnerability with Rhett last night, a moment of connection that had surprised her. She knew it was foolish to read too much into it, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. A hope that perhaps this journey, this unexpected detour, might lead to something more than just survival. They rode in silence for the first few hours, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape was desolate, a vast expanse of rock, sand, and scrub brush. It was a harsh, unforgiving environment, but it also possessed a strange beauty, a stark grandeur that took Madeline's breath away. As they rode, Madeline found herself stealing glances at Rhett. He rode with an easy grace, his body moving in perfect harmony with the horse. He seemed to be a part of the landscape, a natural extension of the wild, untamed West. She wondered, again, about his past, about the experiences that had shaped him into the man he was. She decided to broach the subject, carefully. "You said you were running from ghosts," she said, her voice tentative. "What kind of ghosts?" He didn't answer immediately. He continued to stare straight ahead, his profile a study in stoicism. Madeline almost regretted asking the question, fearing she'd crossed a line. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "The kind that haunt a man's dreams," he said. "The kind that remind him of his mistakes." His words resonated with her. She knew all too well about mistakes, about the choices that could haunt a person for the rest of their life. Thomas's betrayal echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of her own naivete, her own misplaced trust. "We all make mistakes," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. "It's what we do after that matters." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. Something that looked like gratitude? "Easy to say," he muttered, his voice rough. "Harder to live." She knew he was right. It was easy to talk about moving on, about forgiving and forgetting. But it was much harder to actually do it. The wounds of the past, especially those inflicted by betrayal, often ran deep, festering beneath the surface. They rode on in silence for a while longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the heat intensifying. Madeline felt a growing thirst, her throat dry and parched. She reached for her canteen, only to find it empty. She'd forgotten to refill it last night. She glanced at Rhett, wondering if he had any water to spare. He seemed to anticipate her need, reaching for his own canteen and handing it to her without a word. She took a small sip, the cool water a welcome relief. She handed the canteen back to him, her fingers brushing against his. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt of awareness through her. She quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. He took a swig from the canteen, then capped it and returned it to his saddlebag. He didn't comment on her reaction, didn't acknowledge the subtle shift in the atmosphere between them. As they continued their journey, the silence took a different turn. It was no longer completely comfortable, nor was it charged with tension. There was an awareness, a sense of being present, that felt new, like two animals circling each other, studying, assessing. "My ranch," Madeline began, deciding to open another small window into her own past. "It was everything to me. My home. My life. My legacy." Rhett rode silently beside her, listening. "And I lost it because I trusted the wrong man," she said, feeling the bitterness bubble to the surface again. Rhett glanced at her, and for the briefest of moments, she caught an echo of that same bitterness in his eyes. It was a shared pain, a mutual understanding of the sting of betrayal. It was a mirror, and for the first time, she saw not a stranger, but a reflection of her own pain in his eyes. The sun rose, painting the sand with the light of the dawn. Chapter 6. The price of trust on a barren trail. The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile thread connecting their separate, wounded pasts. Rhett didn't offer any platitudes, any easy words of comfort. He simply rode beside her, his presence a silent acknowledgement of her pain. After a long while, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful.
"Trust is a costly thing," he said.
"Especially out here." His words resonated with Madeline. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, at the expense of her home, her marriage, her entire life. She'd trusted Thomas implicitly, had believed in his promises, in his love. And he'd betrayed that trust, leaving her with nothing but ashes and regrets. "I swore I'd never trust another man again," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. Rhett glanced at her, his blue eyes searching hers.
"A hard vow to keep," he said.
"Especially in a world like this." He was right. It was a lonely existence, trying to navigate the world without trusting anyone. It was a constant battle, a constant state of vigilance, of guarding one's heart against any potential hurt.
But it was also exhausting.
"What about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "Do you trust anyone?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He stared out at the horizon, his profile a study in stoicism. "Trust is earned," he said finally, his voice tight. "Not given freely." She understood that. Trust was a precious commodity, something to be guarded carefully, to be bestowed only upon those who had proven themselves worthy. But how did one earn trust? And how did one know when it was safe to give it? The sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat intensifying. The landscape remained desolate, a vast expanse of rock, sand, and scrub brush. Madeline felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling of apprehension. They were alone out here, vulnerable to any number of dangers. Outlaws, wild animals, the elements themselves. She glanced at Rhett, her gaze lingering on the gun belt slung low on his hips. He was a gunfighter, a man of violence, a man who lived by the code of the West. He was a protector, but he was also a threat. She was putting her life in his hands, trusting him to keep her safe. It was a terrifying thought, a leap of faith that went against every instinct she possessed. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question blurted out before she could stop it. She needed to understand his motives, to know what he expected in return. He turned his head, his blue eyes meeting hers. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. "I owe a debt," he said finally, his voice cryptic. "A debt?" Madeline repeated, confused. To whom? He didn't answer immediately. He continued to stare at her, his expression unreadable. To a man I wronged, he said finally, his voice low and strained. A long time ago. His words only deepened the mystery surrounding him. What had he done? Who had he wronged? And how did helping her repay that debt? She longed to ask him more, to delve into the secrets he held so tightly, but she knew it was too soon. She had to be patient, to allow him to reveal himself at his own pace. They rode on in silence for a while longer, the tension between them palpable. Madeline felt a growing sense of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to happen, that their journey was about to take an unexpected turn. Suddenly, Rhett reined in his horse, his body stiffening. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. What is it? Madeline asked, her voice filled with alarm. He held up a hand, silencing her. He listened intently, his gaze fixed on a distant ridge. Riders, he said finally, his voice low and urgent. And not the friendly kind. Madeline's heart leaped into her throat. Outlaws. The very threat she'd been fearing. She looked at Rhett, her eyes wide with fear. He met her gaze, his expression grim. Stay close, he said. And do as I say. He reached for his rifle, his movements quick and efficient. He checked the chamber, his face set in a mask of determination. Madeline felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement. She was in danger, her life on the line.
But she was also alive.
She was facing a challenge, a test of her courage, a chance to prove to herself that she was stronger than she thought. The distant riders grew closer, their silhouettes now visible against the horizon. They were a small band, perhaps 5 or 6, their faces obscured by bandanas. They were riding hard, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust. Rhett raised his rifle, his eyes narrowed, his finger on the trigger. He was ready to defend himself, to defend her. Madeline watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she was also strangely calm. She trusted him. She had no choice but to trust him. Her life was in his hands. And in that moment, staring at the approaching outlaws and the steely glint of determination in Rhett's eyes, she realized that her broken vow might not be so broken after all. Chapter 7. Whispers of a Haunted Past. The outlaws closed in, their horses' hooves pounding the earth like a drumbeat of impending doom. Madeline's breath hitched in her throat, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol tucked into her waistband. It felt inadequate, almost comical, against the threat they faced. Rhett remained calm, his rifle steady, his eyes narrowed, tracking the approaching riders. He didn't fire, didn't make any sudden movements. He simply waited, his patience a chilling contrast to the chaos that was about to erupt.
Who are they?
Madeline whispered, her voice trembling. Rhett didn't answer. He continued to watch the outlaws, his gaze intense, calculating. He seemed to be assessing their numbers, their weapons, their intentions. The outlaws reined in their horses a short distance away, forming a semicircle around them. They were a rough-looking bunch, their faces weathered and scarred, their clothes dusty and torn. They carried rifles, pistols, and knives, their weapons gleaming ominously in the sunlight. The leader, a burly man with a cruel scar across his left cheek, spoke, his voice raspy and menacing. Well, he drawled. What have we here? A lone wolf and his prize? Rhett didn't respond. He simply stared at the leader, his blue eyes cold and unwavering. The leader chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. Cat got your tongue, Lawson?
He said.
Or are you just too scared to speak? Lawson. The name echoed in Madeline's mind. So he was known to these men. And not in a good way, judging by the leader's tone. Leave us be, Cutter, Rhett said finally, his voice low and dangerous. We ain't looking for trouble. Cutter laughed again, the sound sending shivers down Madeline's spine. Trouble found you, Lawson, he said. You know why we're here. Rhett remained silent, his gaze fixed on Cutter. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. We want what you took, Cutter continued, his voice hardening. The gold.
Gold.
So that was it. Rhett was carrying gold. Stolen gold, judging by Cutter's accusation. Madeline's mind raced. Was that the debt he'd spoken of? Was he trying to return the gold to its rightful owners? Or was he simply a thief, running from a law? I don't have any gold, Rhett said, his voice calm, betraying no emotion. Cutter's eyes narrowed. Don't play coy with me, Lawson, he said. We know you took it. We tracked you all the way from Silver Creek. Silver Creek. The town Rhett had said was 2 days' ride east. So he had been there.
And he had taken something.
Madeline's trust in Rhett wavered, crumbling under the weight of this new revelation. Was he a liar? A thief? Had he been using her all along? I ain't got what you're looking for, Rhett repeated, his voice firm. Now ride on. Cutter spat on the ground, his eyes filled with contempt. You always were a stubborn son of a bitch, Lawson, he said. But you can't outrun your past forever. We'll get what's ours, one way or another. He nodded to his men, a silent command. The outlaws raised their rifles, aiming them at Rhett and Madeline. Madeline's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. She was about to die, caught in the crossfire of a gunfight between 2 men she barely knew. Rhett remained calm, his rifle steady, his eyes fixed on Cutter. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he didn't flinch. He was prepared to fight, to die if necessary. Last chance, Lawson, Cutter said, his voice a deadly whisper. Hand over the gold, and we'll let the woman go. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. He was offering to spare her life, in exchange for the gold. But what if Rhett didn't have the gold? What if he was telling the truth? Rhett didn't answer. He simply stared at Cutter, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and sadness. Cutter's patience snapped. Kill them,
he roared.
The air exploded with a sound of gunfire. Madeline screamed, ducking down, her hands covering her head. She expected to feel the searing pain of a bullet, the cold embrace of death. But nothing happened. The gunfire continued, but it was all directed at the outlaws. She looked up, cautiously, her eyes widening in disbelief. Rhett was firing his rifle with lightning speed, his movements precise and deadly. He was a whirlwind of motion, a force of nature, taking down the outlaws one by one. He moved with a practiced grace, honed over years of fighting, of surviving. Each shot was deliberate, each movement calculated. He was a warrior, a gunfighter, a man who knew how to kill. Madeline watched in awe and terror, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd never seen anything like this before. She'd lived a sheltered life, a life of quiet routine, of predictable days. She'd never witnessed such raw violence, such brutal efficiency. Within minutes, it was over. The outlaws lay dead or dying on the ground, their bodies riddled with bullets. Rhett stood among them, his rifle smoking, his chest heaving. He was covered in dust and sweat, his clothes torn, his face grim. He lowered his rifle, his gaze sweeping over the carnage. He showed no remorse, no regret. He'd simply done what he had to do. He had survived. He turned to Madeline, his blue eyes searching hers. She was trembling, her body shaking with shock and adrenaline. She stared at him, her mouth agape, unable to speak. He had saved her life. He had risked his own life to protect her. But he had also revealed a side of himself that terrified her. A side that was capable of such cold-blooded violence. The whispers of the past, she realized, weren't just whispers. They were screams. And they were all directed at him. Who is this man? She thought, with a renewed sense of fear. He holstered his rifle, the click loud in the suddenly still air. He offered her a hand, and she stared, not sure if she should accept. Chapter 8. A shared meal, a shared burden. Madeline stared at his outstretched hand, her mind reeling. The image of him, a whirlwind of deadly efficiency, was seared into her memory. The man who had gently offered her stew and a blanket was the same man who had just killed 5 men without a flicker of remorse. The dichotomy was jarring, unsettling. She hesitated, her hand hovering in the air. Could she trust him? Should she trust him? He had saved her life, but at what cost? And what was the truth about the gold? He didn't push, didn't force her to take his hand. He simply waited, his blue eyes patient, understanding. He knew she was struggling, knew she was questioning everything she thought she knew about him. Finally, she took his hand, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. His hand was rough, calloused, but also strong, reassuring. She allowed him to help her to her feet, her legs shaky and unsteady. She looked at the bodies of the dead outlaws, a wave of nausea washing over her. She'd never seen death up close before, never witnessed such violence. It was a stark reminder of the brutal reality of the West, a world she was only beginning to understand. Rhett didn't say anything. He simply led her away from the carnage, back to his horse. He unsaddled the animal, allowing it to graze. He then gathered some dry brush and started a small fire, his movements efficient and practiced. Madeline sat down on a nearby rock, watching him. She felt numb, drained, her emotions a tangled mess of fear, gratitude, confusion, and something else. A grudging respect for his skill, his courage, his ability to survive in this harsh, unforgiving world. He built the fire, the flames crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. He then retrieved some supplies from his saddlebags, including a small pot, some dried meat, and some coffee. "We need to eat," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "And we need to talk." Madeline nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She knew he was right. They needed to talk. They needed to address the elephant in the room, the unspoken questions that hung between them. He prepared a simple meal of dried meat and coffee, the aroma filling the air, a welcome distraction from the lingering scent of death. He served her a portion in a tin cup, handing it to her without a word. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind. Madeline found that her appetite had returned, despite the events of the past hour. She was hungry, exhausted, and emotionally drained. As she ate, she studied Rhett. He sat across the fire from her, his face illuminated by the flickering light. He looked tired, worn down. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, the shadows darker. He was a man carrying a heavy burden, a burden she was only beginning to understand. "The gold," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "You said you didn't have it." He looked at her, his blue eyes meeting hers. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "I don't," he said, his voice firm. "But Cutter said Cutter was a liar," Rhett interrupted, his voice sharp. "And a thief." "But he said you took it from Silver Creek," Madeline persisted, her confusion growing. Rhett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was in Silver Creek," he admitted. "But I didn't steal any gold." "Then what were you doing there?" Madeline asked, her voice rising slightly. She needed answers, needed to understand what was happening. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He stared into the flames, his expression troubled. "I was looking for someone," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "Someone who owed me something." "And did you find them?" Madeline asked softly. He shook his head.
"No," he said.
"They were gone. Vanished." "So, the gold, it wasn't yours?" Madeline pressed, trying to piece together the puzzle. "No," Rhett said, his voice emphatic. "It belonged to the people of Silver Creek. Cutter and his gang robbed the bank a few weeks back. I was trying to get it back." Madeline's eyes widened. He was trying to return the gold? He was a good guy? Despite his gunfighter past, despite his ability to kill without remorse? "You were trying to help them?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. He nodded. "I owed them," he said. "I owed them a lot." The debt he'd spoken of earlier. It wasn't about owing a single man, it was about a whole town. A town he'd apparently wronged in the past. "What did you do?" Madeline asked, her curiosity piqued. She needed to know, needed to understand the man who had saved her life, the man who was slowly, unexpectedly, chipping away at the walls around her heart. The fire was dying down, and he stood up, adding more branches, bringing it to life. It mirrored, she felt, the conversation they were having. He was slowly revealing parts of himself, fueling her understanding. And with it, a fragile trust was rekindled. Chapter 9. The Unforgiving Landscape of the Heart. Rhett stirred the fire, the flames leaping up, casting his face in a flickering, dramatic light. He hesitated, as if wrestling with the words, with the memories they represented. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. It was a long time ago. He began, his voice low and rough, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. I was younger then, wilder, more foolish. Madeline listened intently, her heart aching for the pain she sensed beneath his stoic exterior. She knew what it was like to carry the weight of past mistakes, to be haunted by the ghosts of one's former self. I rode with a different gang back then, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. A hard bunch. We lived by our own rules, took what we wanted, answered to no one. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. He was confirming her fears, confirming the image of him as a dangerous outlaw. But there was something in his tone, a hint of regret, of self-loathing, that told her there was more to the story. We hit Silver Creek, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Robbed the bank just like Cutter said. But it went wrong. People got hurt. Innocent people. He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, his fingers clenching and unclenching. Madeline could see the tension in his body, the struggle he was going through to relive those painful memories. There was a woman, he said, his voice cracking slightly. She was caught in the crossfire.
She died.
Madeline's heart went out to him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt that he carried like a heavy weight. She understood now the debt he'd spoken of, the reason he was trying to help the people of Silver Creek. He was seeking redemption, trying to atone for his past sins. I didn't pull the trigger, he said, his voice barely audible. But I was there. I was responsible. I rode with the men who did it. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers, his gaze filled with a raw, naked vulnerability that took Madeline's breath away. I've been trying to make amends ever since, he said. Trying to live a different life, to be a better man. His words resonated with Madeline. She, too, was trying to live a different life, to escape the shadow of her past mistakes. She, too, was seeking redemption, a chance to start over, to build something new. It's not easy, she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. The past has a way of clinging to you, of reminding you of who you were. He nodded, his gaze holding hers. It's like this landscape, he said, gesturing towards the vast, unforgiving desert that surrounded them. Harsh, unforgiving, relentless. It shapes you, molds you, leaves its mark on you. His words painted a vivid picture, a metaphor for the internal struggles they both faced. The landscape of their hearts, scarred by past mistakes, by loss and betrayal, was just as harsh and unforgiving as the physical landscape that surrounded them. But even in the desert, Madeline said, her voice gaining strength, there is beauty. There is resilience. There is life. She thought of the tiny wildflowers she'd seen earlier, pushing their way through the cracked earth, their delicate petals defying the harsh conditions. She thought of the cacti, standing tall and proud, their thorns protecting their precious stores of water. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. He seemed to see something in her, something that gave him hope, something that mirrored his own yearning for redemption. You believe that? He asked, his voice a low murmur. I have to, Madeline said, her voice firm. Otherwise, what's the point? He nodded slowly, his gaze holding hers. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of their mutual struggles, their mutual desire for a better future. The fire had burned down to embers, the night growing colder. Rhett added a few more pieces of wood, coaxing the flames back to life. The warmth spread through Madeline, a welcome comfort against the chill of the desert night. But it wasn't just the physical warmth that she felt. It was something more, something deeper. A connection, a bond, forged in the crucible of shared pain and shared hope. She still didn't know everything about Rhett Lawson, about his past, about his secrets. But she knew enough. She knew that he was a man haunted by his past, a man seeking redemption, a man who, despite his rough exterior, possessed a capacity for kindness, for compassion, for love. The thought startled her, sending a shiver of both fear and excitement through her. She pushed it away, telling herself it was foolish, premature. She was still healing, still rebuilding her life. She wasn't ready for another relationship, for another chance at love. But as she looked across the dying embers at Rhett Lawson, at his weathered face, his blue eyes reflecting the flickering light, she couldn't deny the spark of hope that had ignited within her. A spark that perhaps, just perhaps, might one day grow into a flame. The night was silent, and the wind had picked up. The fire danced, and he got up, adding another log. It was then that he pointed to a faint light on the distant horizon.
There, he said.
That will be our destination come morning. Chapter 10. Outlaws and Silent Promises. The faint light on the horizon, a beacon in the vast darkness, offered a glimmer of hope, a promise of civilization. But it also brought a renewed sense of unease. They were closer to their destination, closer to Silver Creek, but also closer to potential danger. Rhett's past, his connection to the town, remained a looming shadow, a source of both intrigue and apprehension. They settled in for the night, the silence between them punctuated only by the crackling of the replenished fire and the howl of the wind. Madeline wrapped herself in the wool blanket, the rough fabric a comforting weight against the growing chill. She watched Rhett, his silhouette outlined against the firelight. He was staring at the distant light, his expression unreadable. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Was he anxious about returning to Silver Creek? Was he worried about facing the consequences of his past actions? Or was he simply focused on the task ahead, on getting her safely to her destination? She longed to ask him, to delve deeper into his thoughts, but she hesitated. She didn't want to push him, to force him to reveal more than he was ready to share. She had to respect his boundaries, to allow him to open up at his own pace. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the desert air crisp and invigorating. They packed up their meager belongings, their movements efficient and silent. There was a sense of purpose in their actions, a shared understanding of the journey ahead. As they rode, the landscape began to change. The flat, desolate expanse of rock and sand gradually gave way to rolling hills, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional hardy tree. The air grew slightly warmer, the sun less harsh. Madeline found herself stealing glances at Rhett, studying his profile. He rode with an easy grace, his body moving in perfect harmony with the horse. He seemed at peace, his expression calm, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What will you do when we reach Silver Creek?" she asked, breaking the silence. He turned his head, his blue eyes meeting hers. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze searching, assessing. "See a man about a horse," he said finally, his voice cryptic. Madeline frowned, confused. "A horse?" she repeated. "What does that mean?" He shrugged, a dismissive gesture that didn't quite mask the underlying tension in his body. "It's just an expression," he said. "Means I have business to attend to." She knew he was evading the question, hiding something from her. But she didn't press him. She had to trust that he would tell her what she needed to know, when he was ready. They rode on in silence for a while longer, the tension between them palpable. Madeline's mind raced, trying to decipher his cryptic words, trying to anticipate what awaited them in Silver Creek. Suddenly, Rhett reined in his horse, his body stiffening. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. "What is it?" Madeline asked, her voice filled with alarm. He held up a hand, silencing her. He listened intently, his gaze fixed on a distant cluster of rocks. "Riders," he said finally, his voice low and urgent. "Hidden. Waiting." Madeline's heart leaped into her throat. Another ambush. But this time it felt different. This time it felt personal. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Rhett didn't answer. He dismounted, his movements quick and efficient. He handed her the reins of his horse. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "And don't move. No matter what." He drew his rifle, his face set in a mask of determination. He then moved towards the rocks, his steps silent and stealthy, disappearing into the shadows. Madeline watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she also felt a surge of admiration. He was risking his life again, this time not to protect her from a random attack, but to confront someone from his past. She waited, her body tense, her senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind and the frantic beating of her heart. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Madeline's anxiety grew with each passing moment. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any indication of what was happening. Suddenly, she heard voices, raised in anger. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized Rhett's voice, low and controlled. Then, she heard a different voice, a voice filled with venom and hatred. A voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Lawson," the voice hissed. "You got a lot of nerve showing your face around here." Madeline's heart sank. It was someone from Silver Creek. Someone who knew Rhett, who hated him. Someone who was connected to his past. The voices continued, their exchange growing more heated. Madeline couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know what was happening. She had to see for herself. She disobeyed Rhett's instructions, her curiosity and concern overriding her fear. She dismounted, tethering the horses to a nearby bush. She then crept towards the rocks, her movements slow and cautious, her heart pounding in her chest. She peered around the edge of a large boulder, her eyes widening in shock at the scene before her. Rhett was standing face to face with a man who was the spitting image of the outlaw leader, Cutter. It was his brother, she realized with a sickening thud. This man was surrounded by others, all armed, all glaring at Rhett with undisguised hatred. The air crackled with tension, with the promise of violence. This was it. The confrontation she'd been anticipating. The reckoning for Rhett's past sins. And she was caught in the middle, a witness to a drama she didn't fully understand. The man, Cutter's brother, spat on the ground. "You think you can just waltz back into town and make everything right?" He sneered. "After what you did." Rhett stood tall, meeting his gaze, his hands far from his holstered weapon, which was visible. Madeline held her breath. It all came down to this. She had an inkling, a deep, chilling inkling of what the next few minutes would bring. And all she could do was watch. Chapter 11. A glimmer of hope in a dusty town. Rhett stood his ground, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes locked onto Cutter's brother. The air vibrated with tension, the silence punctuated only by the harsh rasp of the man's breathing and the distant caw of a crow. "I'm not here to make trouble, Silas," Rhett said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the turmoil Madeline knew he must be feeling. Silas. So that was his name. He was a younger version of Cutter, but with eyes that burned with a fiercer hatred, a deeper resentment. He was a man consumed by vengeance, a man who had lived in the shadow of his brother's death. "You're always trouble, Lawson," Silas spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You and your kind. You brought nothing but misery to this town." The kind he referred to was clear. Outlaws. Men who lived outside the law, who took what they wanted, who answered to no one. Rhett had once been one of them, and Silas clearly hadn't forgotten. "I'm not that man anymore," Rhett said, his voice firm, unwavering. Silas scoffed, a derisive sound that echoed off the surrounding rocks. "Once an outlaw, always an outlaw," he said. "You can't change your stripes, Lawson." "People can change," Rhett countered, his gaze unwavering. "I have changed." Madeline watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She believed him. She had seen the change in him, had witnessed his remorse, his desire for redemption. But would Silas believe him? Would he give Rhett a chance? Silas's men shifted restlessly, their hands hovering over their weapons. They were itching for a fight, eager to avenge Cutter's death, to make Rhett pay for his past sins. "You killed my brother," Silas said, his voice trembling with rage. "You left him to rot in the desert." "He chose his path," Rhett said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He attacked us. I defended myself. He was trying to get back what was rightfully ours." Silas shouted, his face contorted with fury. "The gold you stole." "I didn't steal any gold," Rhett repeated, his patience wearing thin. "I was trying to return it." Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You expect me to believe that?"
he said.
"You, a known thief, a murderer?" "Believe what you want," Rhett said, his voice hardening. "But I'm not here to fight. I'm here to—" He hesitated, his gaze shifting towards Madeline, who was still hidden behind the rocks. He was here for her. He was here to bring her to Silver Creek, to help her start a new life. He was putting her needs before his own, even in the face of this dangerous confrontation. Madeline's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something deeper, warmer. Something that felt dangerously close to affection. Silas followed Rhett's gaze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Madeline. He smirked, a cruel, knowing expression that sent a chill down her spine. Well, he drawled. "Looks like you've found yourself another prize. Is she part of the deal, Lawson? Are you going to use her to bargain your way out of this?" Madeline's blood ran cold. He was threatening her, using her as leverage against Rhett. She was a pawn in their game, a tool to be used and discarded. Rhett's body tensed, his fists clenching. "Leave her out of this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Silas chuckled, enjoying Rhett's discomfort. "Why should I?" he said. "She's with you. She's part of this." "She's innocent," Rhett said, his voice pleading. "She has nothing to do with this." Silas's smirk widened. "Innocent?" he repeated. "In this world, Lawson, there's no such thing as innocence." He raised his hand, signaling to his men. They leveled their rifles, aiming them at Rhett and Madeline. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. This was it. It was over. She was about to die, caught in the crossfire of a feud she didn't understand. Suddenly, a voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the tension. "Hold it right there, Silas." Everyone turned, their eyes widening in surprise. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, a figure that Madeline recognized instantly. It was the sheriff of Silver Creek, a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and a stern expression. He was accompanied by several deputies, all armed and ready. Silas's men hesitated, their rifles wavering. They hadn't expected the sheriff to intervene. "Sheriff Thompson," Silas said, his voice losing some of its bluster. "This ain't your concern." "It is my concern when there's a threat of violence in my town," Sheriff Thompson said, his voice firm and authoritative. "And when an innocent woman is being threatened." He looked at Madeline, his gaze softening slightly. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. Madeline nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, sir," she managed to say. The sheriff turned his attention back to Silas. "Stand down, Silas," he said. "This ends now." Silas glared at the sheriff, his hatred palpable. But he knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. He couldn't fight the law, not here, not now. He lowered his hand, signaling to his men to stand down. They reluctantly obeyed, their rifles lowering. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of relief. Madeline sagged against the rocks, her legs weak, her body shaking. Rhett let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping. He had been spared for now. But the conflict with Silas wasn't over. It was merely postponed. He looked at Sheriff Thompson and gave a small nod. It was an acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps a glimmer of hope for the future. The dusty main street of Silver Creek was in sight. A small, tired, but somehow still determined town. Chapter 12. The Sheriff's Suspicion. The Stranger's Calm. Sheriff Thompson, a man whose presence commanded respect and whose gaze held the weight of years spent upholding the law in a lawless land, kept his eyes fixed on Silas and his men as they reluctantly dispersed, disappearing into the dusty landscape. He then turned his attention to Rhett and Madeline, his expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Lawson," he said, his voice neutral, acknowledging Rhett's presence without offering any warmth or welcome. "What brings you back to Silver Creek?" Rhett met the sheriff's gaze, his expression calm, his blue eyes unwavering. "Passing through," he said, his voice giving nothing away. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. Passing through? He repeated. With a woman you picked up on the trail? He looked at Madeline, his gaze softening slightly. Ma'am, are you traveling with this man willingly? Madeline nodded, her voice stronger now. Yes, Sheriff, she said. Mr. Lawson saved my life.
Twice.
The sheriff's gaze shifted back to Rhett, his eyes narrowing. He knew Rhett's reputation, knew his past. He was a gunfighter, a former outlaw, a man who had lived outside the law. He was a dangerous man, even if he claimed to have changed. I heard about Cutter and his gang, the sheriff said, his voice turning hard. You were involved in that, weren't you? Rhett didn't flinch, didn't deny it.
They attacked us, he said.
I defended myself. And the woman. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. He was trying to determine the truth, to assess whether Rhett was a threat to his town. You were trying to return the gold, Madeline interjected, her voice clear and strong.
You told me.
The sheriff looked at her, surprised. The gold? He repeated. What gold? The gold Cutter's gang stole from the bank, Madeline explained.
Mr. Lawson said he was trying to get it back. For the town.
The sheriff's expression changed, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, crossing his features. He looked back at Rhett, his gaze softening slightly. Is that true, Lawson? He asked, his voice losing some of its harshness. Rhett nodded, his gaze unwavering. I was, he said. But Cutter found me first. The sheriff let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. He had misjudged Rhett, at least partially. He was still a dangerous man, a man with a violent past, but he wasn't the enemy he'd assumed him to be. The gold is still out there. Then, the sheriff said, his voice thoughtful. Likely buried somewhere, Rhett said. Cutter wouldn't have kept it on him. The sheriff nodded, his mind already working, calculating. Recovering the stolen gold would be a boon for Silver Creek, a town that had been struggling since the robbery. I appreciate you trying to help, Lawson, the sheriff said, his voice grudgingly respectful. But I can't have you causing any more trouble in my town. I'm not here to cause trouble, Rhett said, his voice firm. I'm just passing through. With the lady. The sheriff looked at Madeline again, his gaze lingering on her face. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the lines of worry etched around her mouth. He saw a woman who had been through a lot, a woman who was seeking a fresh start. What's your name, ma'am? He asked, his voice gentle. Madeline Sullivan, she said. I'm looking for a place to settle down. A place to start over. The sheriff nodded, understanding. He'd seen many people like her, people who had come to the West seeking a new life, a chance to escape their past. Silver Creek could use a woman like you, Mrs. Sullivan, he said. We're a small town, but we're a good town. We look out for each other. Madeline's eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Sheriff, she said. I appreciate that. The sheriff turned his attention back to Rhett. Lawson, he said, his voice firm. You're welcome to stay the night. But I expect you to be gone by morning. No trouble. No guns. Understand? Rhett nodded, his gaze unwavering. Understood, he said. The sheriff nodded in return, then turned and walked towards the town, his deputies following close behind. Madeline let out a sigh of relief, her body relaxing. She had been spared, again. And she had found a potential haven, a place where she might be able to rebuild her life. She looked at Rhett, her gaze filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere. For everything. He met her gaze, his blue eyes softening. You don't need to thank me, he said. I just did what anyone would have done. But she knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger. Not everyone would have faced down a gang of outlaws or confronted a vengeful brother. Rhett Lawson was a different kind of man, a man with a hidden depth, a man who was slowly, unexpectedly, capturing her heart. They walked towards the town, side by side, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. The dusty main street was quiet, the buildings weathered and worn, the people going about their evening routines. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a glimmer of hope in a dusty, unforgiving world. The sheriff had directed them towards the town's only boarding house, run by a stern-looking but ultimately kind widow named Mrs. Abernathy. Rhett had paid for a room for Madeline, insisting on it, despite her protests. "I'll be fine," he'd said, glancing towards the town's livery stable. And as Madeline watched him walk away, she felt a pang of something. Loneliness? Regret? Or the faint, fragile hope of something more? She couldn't quite put her finger on it. But it was there. Chapter 13. Hidden Truths in a Weathered Homestead. Mrs. Abernathy, a woman whose face bore the map of a life lived fully, if not easily, on the frontier, showed Madeline to a small, but clean and comfortable room on the second floor of the boarding house. The room overlooked the main street, offering a view of the comings and goings of Silver Creek's inhabitants. It was sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table, and a single chair. But it was clean and it was safe, and it was hers, at least for the night. Madeline set down her meager belongings, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had been traveling for weeks, living on adrenaline and hope, her body and mind pushed to their limits. She needed rest, she needed respite, she needed to gather her strength and plan her next move. After washing the dust and grime from her face and hands, she sat down on the edge of the bed, her gaze drawn to the window. She watched the people below, their faces etched with the hardships and resilience of frontier life. She saw families, children, cowboys, merchants, all going about their daily routines, their lives intertwined, their fates interconnected. She wondered if she could find a place among them, if she could build a new life in this small, dusty town. She had no skills, no experience, other than running a ranch, a life that was now lost to her forever. She was a woman alone, in a world dominated by men, a world where survival depended on strength and resilience. She thought of Rhett, of his unexpected kindness, his quiet strength, his hidden depths. He had saved her life, had brought her to this place, had given her a chance to start over. She owed him a debt of gratitude, a debt she wasn't sure how to repay. She also felt a growing something else for him, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond respect, something that felt dangerously close to attraction. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it was foolish, inappropriate. She was too old for such feelings, too wounded, too wary. But the feelings persisted, a faint, persistent warmth in the cold, empty spaces of her heart. She couldn't deny the way her heart quickened when she looked at him, the way her senses heightened when he was near. She couldn't deny the spark of hope that he had ignited within her, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't destined to be alone forever. A knock on the door startled her, pulling her from her reverie. She stood up, smoothing her dress, her heart beating a little faster. "Come in," she said, her voice slightly trembling. The door opened, and Rhett stepped inside. He looked different somehow. He had washed up, had changed into a clean shirt, had brushed the dust from his hat. He looked less like a gunfighter and more like a man. A handsome man. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a warmth spread through her body. She quickly looked away, embarrassed by her reaction. I just wanted to check on you," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Make sure you were settled in." "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Thank you. For everything." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. He seemed to be searching for something, assessing her mood, her feelings. "Mrs. Abernathy said there's a small homestead for sale," he said, his voice changing the subject. "Just outside of town. It's been empty for a while. Needs some work." Madeline's eyes widened. A homestead? Her own place? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know," she said, her voice filled with doubt. "I don't have much money." "I could help you," he said, his voice sincere. "With the money."
And the work.
Madeline's heart skipped a beat. He was offering to help her, again. He was offering her a chance at a new life, a chance at independence, a chance at happiness?
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He looked out the window, his profile silhouetted against the fading light. "I told you," he said, his voice low and strained. "I owe a debt." "But not to me," Madeline said, her voice firm. "You saved my life. You brought me here. You've done more than enough." He turned back to her, his blue eyes meeting hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, wrestling with his own inner demons. "It's not just about the debt," he said finally, his voice barely audible. It's about wanting to see you safe.
Happy."
His words sent a shiver through Madeline, a wave of warmth that melted the icy walls around her heart. He cared about her. He actually cared about her. Before she could respond, there was another knock on the door, louder this time, more insistent. Rhett's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards his hip, where his gun would normally be. He had left it downstairs, at the sheriff's insistence. Madeline's heart pounded in her chest. Trouble. Again. Rhett opened the door cautiously, his body shielding Madeline. It was Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, his expression troubled. "Lawson," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to talk."
Now.
Behind the sheriff, Madeline could see a small crowd gathering, and at its center, the unmistakable figure of Silas, his face contorted with rage. And in his hand was a book. A small, worn, leather-bound book. The book Madeline had seen in Rhett's saddlebag. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Family Legacy. Madeline's gaze locked onto the book in Silas's hand, her mind reeling. The small, worn, leather-bound book she'd glimpsed in Rhett's saddlebag, the one that had sparked her curiosity. It was more than just a book, it was a symbol, a key to unlocking the secrets of Rhett's past. "What's going on, Sheriff?" Rhett asked, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of concern. "Silas here claims you stole something from him," the sheriff said, his gaze shifting between Rhett and Silas. "Something personal." Silas stepped forward, his eyes blazing with hatred. "He took it," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "He took my father's journal. The only thing I have left of him." Madeline's breath caught in her throat. A journal. So that was it. The book wasn't just a random possession, it was a family heirloom, a link to Silas's deceased father, a man who had clearly been important to him. Rhett's expression remained stoic, but Madeline could see the subtle shift in his body language, the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He knew this was serious. "I didn't steal anything," Rhett said, his voice firm, unwavering. Silas scoffed, a derisive sound that echoed through the room. "You're a liar, Lawson," he shouted. "Just like your father." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Madeline's eyes widened. His father? What did Rhett's father have to do with this? The sheriff stepped between them, his hand raised. "Enough, Silas," he said, his voice firm. "Let's handle this calmly." He turned to Rhett. "Lawson, did you take anything from Silas's property?" Rhett hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Madeline for a split second. He was clearly conflicted, torn between telling the truth and protecting something. Or someone. "I found a book," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Near where Cutter and his gang were camped. I didn't know it belonged to Silas." Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You expect us to believe that?" he said. "You just found it? Lying in the dirt?" "It was near a saddlebag," Rhett said, his voice still calm. "One that looked like it belonged to Cutter." "So you admit you were snooping around?" Silas exclaimed, his voice rising in triumph. "Looking for the gold." "I was looking for clues," Rhett corrected, his voice hardening. "Trying to figure out where Cutter might have hidden it." "Lies," Silas shouted. "All lies." The sheriff held up his hand again, silencing Silas. "Lawson, do you have the book?" Rhett nodded. "It's in my saddlebag," he said. "Downstairs." "Get it," the sheriff said, his voice commanding. Rhett hesitated for a moment, then turned and left the room, his steps heavy. Madeline watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She was caught in the middle of a conflict she didn't fully understand, a conflict that was rooted in the past, in family history, in secrets and lies. She looked at Silas, his face still contorted with rage, his eyes burning with hatred. She saw a man consumed by grief and vengeance, a man desperate to reclaim a piece of his lost past. She looked at the sheriff, his expression grim and determined, his duty to uphold the law, to maintain peace in his town. She looked at the gathering crowd, their faces curious and anxious, their eyes watching the drama unfold. She felt a wave of helplessness, of being caught in a storm that was not of her making. But she also felt a growing determination to understand, to help, to find a way to resolve this conflict, to bring peace to this troubled town. Rhett returned, his expression somber. He held the book in his hand, the leather worn and faded, the pages yellowed with age. He handed it to the sheriff, his gaze avoiding Silas's eyes. The sheriff took the book, examining it carefully. He opened it, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the handwritten entries. "This is my father's handwriting," Silas said, his voice trembling with emotion. "He wrote in this journal every day. It's his life, his thoughts, his secrets." The sheriff nodded, his expression softening slightly. He understood the significance of the book, the emotional weight it carried. He closed the book and handed it to Silas.
"Take it," he said.
"It's yours." Silas took the book, clutching it to his chest, his eyes filling with tears. He looked at Rhett, his hatred still evident, but mixed with something else, a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The sheriff turned to Rhett. "Lawson," he said, his voice stern. "I believe you didn't intend to steal this book. But you were careless. You should have been more careful." "I know," Rhett said, his voice low and contrite. "I'm sorry." The sheriff nodded, accepting his apology. "All right," he said. "This matter is closed. But I'm still expecting you to leave town in the morning, Lawson. No more trouble." "I understand," Rhett said, his gaze unwavering. The sheriff nodded again, then turned and addressed the crowd. "All right, folks," he said. "Show's over. Go on home." The crowd slowly dispersed, their curiosity satisfied, their whispers following them. Silas, still clutching the journal, turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his anger seemingly dissipated. Madeline and Rhett were left in her small room. "I had no right to take that," Rhett said, finally breaking the tense quiet. His voice held a deep shame. "It was just familiar. I recognized the script." "Your father?" Madeline asked quietly. He nodded. "He had a book just like that." He turned and stared out the window. "And a long time ago, he rode with Silas's father. It was the missing piece. The final connection to the whispers of his past." Chapter 15. A dance of desire and denial. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and profound. Rhett's father and Silas's father, riding together, bound by a shared past, a shared history. It explained so much: Rhett's connection to Silver Creek, his sense of guilt, his desire for redemption. It also explained Silas's intense hatred, his unwavering belief in Rhett's inherent criminality. Madeline watched Rhett, his silhouette framed against the window, the fading light casting long shadows across the room. He looked lost, caught between his past and his present, struggling to reconcile the man he was with the man he wanted to be. "What happened?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. "Between your fathers?" He turned to her, his blue eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. "They were partners," he said, his voice low and rough. "In everything. Robberies, rustling, you name it. They were two of a kind." Madeline listened, her heart aching for him. She could imagine the burden he carried, the weight of his father's legacy, the shame he felt for the choices his father had made. "But then something changed," Rhett continued, his voice barely a whisper. "My father, he wanted out. He wanted a different life. He met my mother, fell in love, wanted to settle down, go straight." "And Silas's father?" Madeline prompted gently. Rhett's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "He didn't want to let him go," he said. "He saw it as a betrayal. He tried to force my father to stay, to continue their partnership." "What happened?" Madeline asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Rhett hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He stared out the window, his profile a study in pain and regret. "There was a fight," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A gunfight. My father, he killed Silas's father. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, forming a tragic picture. Rhett's father, trying to escape a life of crime, forced to kill his former partner, his friend, in self-defense. And Silas, growing up with the story of his father's death, fueled by hatred and a thirst for vengeance. I understand now, Madeline said softly. Why Silas hates you so much. Rhett nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon.
It's more than just hatred, he said.
It's a blood feud. A family legacy of violence and revenge. He turned back to her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of despair and resignation. I can't escape it, he said. It's in my blood. It's who I am. No, Madeline said, her voice firm, unwavering. That's not true. You're not your father. You're your own man. You've made different choices. You're trying to be better. He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. He seemed to be looking for something, for reassurance, for validation, for hope. Madeline stepped closer to him, her heart aching for him. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a warmth that spread through her body. You are a good man, Rhett Lawson, she said, her voice sincere, her gaze holding his. I see it. I feel it. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and longing. He seemed to be drawn to her, pulled by an invisible force, a connection that transcended their shared past, their shared pain. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was tender, hesitant, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile, something precious. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. She felt a warmth spread through her, a desire that she had long suppressed, a longing that she had thought she would never feel again. They stood there, gazing into each other's eyes, the silence filled with unspoken emotions, with a growing tension, a palpable attraction. The air crackled with electricity, with the unspoken promise of something more. Rhett's gaze dropped to her lips, his eyes darkening with desire. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. Madeline's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should stop him, should push him away, should maintain a distance. She was too old for this, too wounded, too wary. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, irresistibly drawn to his strength, his vulnerability, his hidden depths. She wanted him, needed him, in a way she hadn't wanted or needed anyone in years. Their lips met, a tentative touch at first, a gentle exploration. Then, the kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. Madeline closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the flood of emotions that washed over her. It was a kiss filled with longing, with desire, with a desperate need for connection, for solace, for love. It was a kiss that erased the years, the pain, the regrets, leaving only the present moment, the shared intimacy, the undeniable spark between them. Suddenly, Rhett pulled away, his breath ragged, his eyes filled with confusion and regret. I can't, he said, his voice hoarse. I shouldn't have done that. Madeline's heart sank. She felt a wave of disappointment, of embarrassment, of rejection. I understand, she said, her voice trembling. She turned away, her cheeks flushed, her body shaking. It's not you, Rhett said quickly, his voice filled with urgency. It's me.
Am I not good for you? I'm dumb and goats.
I'll only bring you pain. Don't say that, Madeline said, her voice pleading. You're a good man, Rhett. I know it. You don't know me, he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of. He turned and walked towards the door, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. He paused at the threshold, his back to her. I'm leaving in the morning, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Like the sheriff said. And then, he was gone, leaving Madeline alone in the small, empty room, her heart aching, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The dance was over, and all that remained was the denial. The lingering scent of him, of leather and horses and the desert wind, was a painful reminder of what could have been. Chapter 16. Blood on the horizon, bonds forged in fire. Madeline spent a restless night, tossing and turning in the narrow bed, her mind replaying the events of the evening. Rhett's confession, his kiss, his subsequent rejection, it was all a jumbled mess of emotions, of conflicting desires and fears. She longed for him, for his touch, for his presence, but she also understood his hesitation, his fear of hurting her, of dragging her into his troubled past. She awoke with the first light of dawn, feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. She dressed quickly, her movements mechanical, her mind preoccupied. She had to see him, to talk to him, to try to understand, to try to what? Convince him to stay? To give them a chance?
She didn't know.
She only knew that she couldn't let him leave without a fight. She left the boarding house, the cool morning air brushing against her face. The town was just beginning to stir, the streets quiet, the shops still closed. She headed towards the livery stable, her heart pounding in her chest, her steps hesitant but determined. She found him there, saddling his horse, his movements efficient and practiced. He looked up as she approached, his blue eyes meeting hers. He didn't smile, didn't offer any greeting. He simply looked at her, his expression guarded, his body tense. "Rhett," she said, her voice a little breathless. I need to talk to you." He nodded, his gaze unwavering.
"I figured you would," he said.
He finished saddling his horse, then turned to face her, his hands resting on his hips. He looked resigned, as if he were bracing himself for a difficult conversation. "I don't want you to go," Madeline said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. "I told you," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "I'm not good for you. I'll only bring you pain." "That's not true," Madeline said, her voice firm. "You've brought me nothing but kindness and protection. You saved my life multiple times." "And I put your life in danger," he countered, his voice sharp. "Because of my past, because of who I am." "You're not your past," Madeline said, her voice pleading. "You're more than that.
You're a good man, Rhett."
"I see it." He shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground.
"You don't know the whole story," he said.
"You don't know what I've done." "Tell me," Madeline said, her voice soft.
"Tell me everything."
"Let me understand." He hesitated, his body tensing. He seemed to be wrestling with his own inner demons, with the secrets he had kept hidden for so long. Suddenly, a shout rang out, shattering the quiet morning air. "Lawson!" They both turned, their eyes widening in alarm. Silas was standing at the entrance of the livery stable, his face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with hatred. He was flanked by several men, all armed and looking menacing. "I told you to leave town," Silas shouted, his voice trembling with fury. "But you just couldn't stay away, could you?" Rhett's body stiffened, his hand instinctively moving towards his hip, where his gun would normally be. He had returned it to the sheriff as requested. He was unarmed. "I'm leaving, Silas," Rhett said, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of apprehension. "Just let me go." "It's too late for that," Silas said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're going to pay for what you did. For what your father did." He raised his hand, signaling to his men. They advanced, their weapons drawn, their intentions clear. Madeline's heart leaped into her throat. This was it. A showdown. A fight to the death. And Rhett was unarmed.
"No,"
Madeline shouted, stepping forward, placing herself between Rhett and Silas. "Don't do this. Please." Silas glared at her, his hatred palpable. "Get out of the way, woman," he said. "This ain't your fight." "It is my fight," Madeline said, her voice firm, unwavering. "He saved my life. I won't let you hurt him." Silas scoffed, a derisive sound. "You're a fool, old woman," he said. "He's using you. He doesn't care about you." "That's not true," Madeline said, her voice pleading. "He's a good man. He's trying to change." Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound.
"He's an outlaw," he said.
"A killer. He'll never change." He pushed Madeline aside, roughly, sending her stumbling backwards. She fell to the ground, her head hitting the hard-packed earth. Rhett reacted instantly, his body moving with lightning speed. He lunged forward, tackling Silas, sending them both crashing to the ground. The other men hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had come to kill Rhett, not to fight him hand to hand. Rhett and Silas grappled on the ground, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle. Rhett, despite being unarmed, was a skilled fighter, his movements quick and efficient. He managed to disarm Silas, knocking his gun away. But the other men quickly recovered, closing in on Rhett, their weapons raised. Suddenly, gunshots rang out, echoing through the livery stable. The men surrounding Rhett staggered, clutching their wounds, their faces contorted in pain. Madeline, dazed but conscious, looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. Sheriff Thompson stood at the entrance of the livery stable, his rifle smoking, his deputies behind him, their weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff shouted, his voice commanding.
Now.
Silas's men, wounded and outnumbered, reluctantly obeyed, dropping their guns to the ground. The sheriff approached Rhett and Silas, who were still struggling on the ground. He pulled them apart, his grip firm. "It's over, Silas," the sheriff said, his voice stern. "You're under arrest." Silas glared at the sheriff, his hatred still evident, but his fight gone. He was defeated. The sheriff turned to Rhett, his expression softening slightly. "You all right, Lawson?" he asked. Rhett nodded, his chest heaving, his body bruised and battered. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." The sheriff nodded in return, then turned his attention to Madeline, who was slowly getting to her feet. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I think I'm all right," Madeline said, her voice trembling. She felt a throbbing pain in her head, but she ignored it. She looked at Rhett, her gaze filled with gratitude, and something more. He had fought for her, had protected her, even when unarmed. He had proven his courage, his loyalty, his love. Rhett met her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of relief and tenderness. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with concern. Madeline nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She leaned into his touch, her body seeking his warmth, his strength. The horizon, still stained with the red of the rising sun mixed with the gun smoke, was slowly fading. But the bonds forged in this crucible of violence were stronger than ever. Chapter 17. The Ghosts of Yesterday's Choices. The aftermath of the confrontation at the livery stable left Silver Creek shaken, but also strangely united. Silas and his men were in jail, awaiting trial, their reign of terror brought to an end. Sheriff Thompson, though initially suspicious of Rhett, had witnessed his bravery firsthand, his willingness to defend Madeline, even unarmed. The townspeople, too, had seen a different side of Rhett Lawson, a side that challenged their preconceived notions about the former outlaw. Madeline, despite a throbbing headache and a collection of bruises, felt a sense of relief, a weight lifted from her shoulders. The immediate threat was over, but the underlying issues, the ghosts of Rhett's past, still lingered. Rhett, though physically unharmed, was emotionally drained. He had faced his demons, confronted the consequences of his father's choices, and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least with his honor intact. Sheriff Thompson, after ensuring Silas and his men were securely locked up, and after seeing to Madeline's minor injuries, had a long conversation with Rhett, a conversation that took place behind closed doors in his office. Madeline wasn't privy to the details, but she could sense the shift in the sheriff's attitude towards Rhett, a grudging respect replacing his initial suspicion. When Rhett finally emerged from the sheriff's office, he looked different. Heavier, somehow, burdened by the weight of the past, but also lighter, as if a load had been lifted from his shoulders. He found Madeline waiting for him outside the boarding house, sitting on a bench, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He sat down beside her, the silence stretching between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken emotions. "He told me everything," Rhett said finally, his voice low and rough. "About my father, about Silas's father, about the feud." Madeline nodded, her heart aching for him. She had pieced together most of the story, but hearing it from Rhett, hearing the pain and regret in his voice, made it all the more real, all the more tragic. Your father, he tried to do the right thing, Madeline said softly. He wanted a different life. Rhett nodded, his gaze fixed on his hands, his fingers clenching and unclenching.
He did, he said.
But it was too late. The past, it always catches up with you. But you're not your father, Madeline said, her voice firm. You've made different choices. You're trying to be a better man. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Thanks to you, he said, his voice barely a whisper.
You believe in me.
Even when I didn't believe in myself. Madeline reached out, her hand gently covering his. The contact sent a warmth through her, a connection that transcended their shared pain, their shared past. I do believe in you, Rhett, she said, her voice sincere, her gaze holding his. I see the good in you. I see the man you are, not the man you were. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. The sheriff, he offered me a job, Rhett said, his voice changing the subject, but his gaze still locked on hers. Madeline's eyes widened in surprise. A job? She repeated. What kind of job? Deputy, Rhett said, a faint smile touching the corners of his lips. He said he could use a man with my skills. Someone who knows how outlaws think, how they operate. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. A deputy? Rhett? It was unexpected, but also fitting. He had a sense of justice, a desire to protect the innocent, a willingness to put himself in harm's way for others. He would make a good lawman. That's wonderful, Rhett, she said, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. You'd be great at it. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. It would mean staying in Silver Creek, he said, his voice hesitant. Madeline's heart fluttered. Staying in Silver Creek? With her? The thought sent a thrill of excitement through her, a spark of hope that she had long suppressed. I think that would be a good thing, she said, her voice a little breathless. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his weathered face, making him look younger, more carefree. So do I, he said, his voice soft, his gaze lingering on her lips. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken desires, with a growing tension, a palpable attraction. But this time, there was no hesitation, no fear, no regret. He leaned in, his lips gently meeting hers. It was a kiss filled with tenderness, with gratitude, with a promise of a future together, a future free from the ghosts of the past, a future built on trust, respect, and love. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. Madeline closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the flood of emotions that washed over her. She was no longer alone. She had found a partner, a companion, a lover, in the most unexpected of places, in the most unexpected of men. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts beating in unison. There's that homestead, Rhett said, his voice a little husky. The one Mrs. Abernathy mentioned. We could fix it up. Together. Madeline's heart swelled with happiness. A home. Together. It was a dream she had thought she would never realize, a dream that had seemed lost forever. I'd like that very much, she said, her voice filled with emotion, her eyes shining with tears of joy. The sun began to set on the horizon. The choices of yesterday were firmly in the past. And as they walked, hand in hand, down the main street of Silver Creek, the townsfolk, those who had been suspicious, now smiled and tipped their hats. They had not just gained a deputy. They had gained a couple. A family. Chapter 18. A reckoning under the desert moon. The decision to stay in Silver Creek, to build a life together, to transform the weathered homestead into a home, filled Madeline with a sense of purpose, a renewed sense of hope that she hadn't felt in years. The prospect of working alongside Rhett, of sharing their days and nights, of building a future together, filled her with a quiet joy, a deep-seated contentment. But the past, like the ever-present desert wind, still whispered its secrets, still threatened to disrupt their newfound peace. Silas, though in jail, remained a looming presence, a symbol of the unresolved conflict, the lingering resentment that simmered beneath the surface of Silver Creek's seemingly tranquil facade. Rhett, despite his acceptance of the deputy position, still carried the weight of his father's legacy, the burden of his own past choices. He was determined to prove himself worthy of Madeline's trust, of the town's acceptance, of his newfound role as a lawman. But he knew that the road to redemption was long and arduous, fraught with challenges and obstacles. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and red, Rhett received a summons. A message from Silas, requesting a meeting, a private conversation, away from the prying eyes of the law. Madeline, understandably concerned, urged Rhett not to go. "It's a trap," she warned, her voice filled with apprehension. "He wants revenge. He'll never forgive you." Rhett, however, felt a sense of obligation, a need to confront Silas, to try to find some resolution, some closure to the conflict that had plagued them both. "I have to go, Madeline," he said, his voice firm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "I need to face him, to try to make him understand." "Understand what?" Madeline countered, her voice rising slightly. "That your father killed his father? That you rode with outlaws?" "He'll never understand, Rhett. He's consumed by hatred." "Maybe," Rhett conceded. "But I have to try. For my own peace of mind. For our future." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I promise you, Madeline," he said, his voice soft, his gaze unwavering. "I'll be careful. I won't let anything happen to me. I have too much to live for now." His words, his touch, reassured her, but didn't entirely alleviate her fears. She knew the danger, the volatility of the situation. She knew that Silas was a desperate man, a man driven by vengeance, a man capable of anything. Reluctantly, she agreed to let him go, her heart heavy with apprehension, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. She watched him ride off into the gathering darkness, his silhouette disappearing against the vast, star-studded sky. She waited, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She paced the small room in the boarding house, her mind racing, her imagination conjuring up all sorts of horrific images. The night was long, the silence deafening, broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote and the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes straining to see through the dim light. It was Rhett, his horse weary, his body covered in dust, his face grim. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff, his expression unreadable. Madeline rushed outside, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation.
"Rhett!"
she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "Are you all right? What happened?" He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Something that looked like peace? "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's over, Madeline. It's finally over." He explained what had happened. He had met with Silas, alone, under the desert moon. They had talked, argued, shouted, even fought. But eventually something had shifted. Silas, seeing Rhett's genuine remorse, his willingness to atone for his past, his commitment to a new life, had finally begun to understand. "He showed me something," Rhett said, his voice filled with emotion. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. Madeline recognized it instantly. It was identical to the journal Silas had reclaimed, the journal that had belonged to his father. This was my father's," Rhett said, his voice trembling. "He gave it to Silas's father, years ago, as a token of their friendship, a promise of a better future." He opened the book, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the handwritten entries. He stopped at a particular page, his finger tracing the faded ink. "He wrote about me," Rhett said, his voice choked with emotion. "About how much he loved me, how much he wanted me to have a different life, a better life. He looked up at Madeline, his blue eyes filled with tears. Silas, he finally understood, he said. He realized that my father wasn't a monster. He was just a man trying to do the right thing. And Silas? Madeline asked softly.
He let go, Rhett said.
He forgave me. He forgave my father. He finally found peace. He handed the book over to Madeline. It felt warm to the touch. As she flicked through the pages, the ink faded, but the message undeniable. She felt a release. The weight of generations of pain and misunderstanding lifted. The reckoning under the desert moon had brought not revenge, but resolution. Not death, but healing. Not hatred, but forgiveness. It was a new dawn, not just for Rhett and Madeline, but for Silver Creek as well. The desert, once a witness to so much pain, was now a silent guardian of their future. Chapter 19. Love's Fragile Bloom in Barren Ground. With Silas's forgiveness, a new chapter began for Rhett and Madeline, a chapter filled with the promise of a shared future, a future built on trust, understanding, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. They began working on the homestead, transforming the dilapidated structure into a cozy, welcoming home. Rhett, with his skills honed by years of living on the land, repaired the roof, reinforced the walls, and rebuilt the fences. Madeline, with her innate sense of home and her determination to create a sanctuary, cleaned, scrubbed, and decorated, breathing life back into the long-abandoned dwelling. They worked side by side, their days filled with the rhythm of physical labor, their evenings spent sharing stories, dreams, and quiet moments of intimacy. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, their love growing stronger, more resilient, like a hardy desert flower pushing its way through the cracked, barren ground. The townspeople of Silver Creek, initially wary of Rhett, gradually warmed to him, witnessing his transformation, his commitment to his new role as deputy, his genuine affection for Madeline. They saw a man who had shed his outlaw past, a man who was striving to be a force for good in their community. Sheriff Thompson, initially skeptical, became a mentor and a friend, guiding Rhett, sharing his wisdom and offering his support. He saw in Rhett a potential successor, a man who could carry on his legacy of upholding the law and protecting the innocent. Madeline, too, found her place in Silver Creek. She became a beloved figure, known for her kindness, her generosity, her unwavering spirit. She helped Mrs. Abernathy at the boarding house, offered comfort to those in need, and even started a small garden behind the homestead, coaxing life from the dry, dusty soil. The homestead, once a symbol of neglect and abandonment, became a beacon of hope, a testament to the transformative power of love and second chances. It was a place where laughter echoed, where friendships blossomed, where a new family was taking root. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Rhett and Madeline sat on the porch of their newly renovated home, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with contentment. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Madeline said softly, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "After Thomas, after everything, I thought I was destined to be alone." Rhett squeezed her hand, his blue eyes filled with tenderness. "And I never thought I deserved happiness," he said, his voice low and rough. "After all the mistakes I'd made, after all the pain I'd caused, I thought I was beyond redemption. But we found each other," Madeline said, her voice filled with wonder. "In this vast, unforgiving land we found each other." Rhett nodded, his gaze locking onto hers. "We did," he said. "And we found something more. We found a home, a family, a love that will last a lifetime." He leaned in, his lips gently meeting hers. It was a kiss filled with passion, with gratitude, with the promise of a future filled with joy, with companionship, with unwavering devotion. The kiss deepened, their bodies drawing closer, their hearts beating as one. They were no longer two lost souls, wandering aimlessly through the desert. They were two halves of a whole, bound together by a love that had defied the odds, a love that had bloomed in the most barren of grounds. As the stars began to appear in the vast, inky blackness of the night sky, Madeline and Rhett remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, their silence filled with unspoken words, with shared dreams, with the quiet certainty that they had found their forever home, their forever love. The scent of the small wildflowers Madeline had planted wafted on the breeze, a gentle, delicate perfume. They represented, to both of them, the tenacious, resilient, and beautiful nature of their love. "We should have a name," Madeline said, quietly looking around. Rhett nodded. "We should. Any ideas?" She smiled. "How about Second Chance Ranch?" He smiled back. "I like that very much." He leaned in and kissed her again, the stars above them silent witnesses to their enduring love. They had found their place, and they were ready for anything, together. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Life at Second Chance Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm, a blend of hard work, quiet companionship, and the ever-present undercurrent of a love that had blossomed against all odds. Rhett, as deputy, divided his time between the ranch and the town, upholding the law, protecting the innocent, and earning the respect of the community he had once wronged. Madeline, the heart of their home, tended to the garden, cared for the animals, and welcomed visitors with open arms and a warm smile. But the tranquility of their lives, like the calm before a storm, was destined to be disrupted. The past, though seemingly buried, had a way of resurfacing, of testing the strength of their bond, of challenging their hard-won peace. Word reached Silver Creek of a new threat, a band of outlaws, even more ruthless and dangerous than Cutter's gang, who were terrorizing the surrounding territories, leaving a trail of destruction and bloodshed in their wake. The leader, a shadowy figure known only as the Serpent, was said to be cunning, cruel, and utterly without mercy. Sheriff Thompson, his aging body weary but his spirit undaunted, knew that Silver Creek was in danger. He called upon Rhett, his trusted deputy, to help him prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Rhett, torn between his duty to protect the town and his desire to shield Madeline from harm, hesitated. He had promised her a peaceful life, a life free from violence and fear. But he also knew that he couldn't stand idly by while innocent people were threatened. Madeline, sensing his inner turmoil, reassured him. "Go, Rhett," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with unwavering support. "Do what you have to do. I'll be here, waiting for you." Her words, her faith in him, gave him the strength he needed. He kissed her a long, lingering kiss filled with love and a silent promise of return, and then rode off with Sheriff Thompson and a small posse of deputized townsmen to face the looming threat. Madeline watched them go, her heart heavy with apprehension, her mind filled with prayers for their safety. She knew the risks, the dangers they faced. She knew that this could be the final confrontation, the ultimate test of their love and their resilience. Days turned into nights, filled with agonizing silence, with a constant fear that each passing moment might bring news of tragedy. Madeline kept herself busy, tending to the ranch, caring for the animals, and offering comfort to the anxious townspeople. But her thoughts were always with Rhett, her heart yearning for his safe return. Finally, word arrived. A messenger, weary and bloodied, rode into Silver Creek, bearing news of the battle. The outlaws had been defeated, their reign of terror brought to an end. But the victory had come at a cost. Sheriff Thompson had been wounded, seriously injured in the fight, and Rhett had faced the Serpent in a final, desperate showdown. Madeline's heart sank. She rushed to the makeshift hospital that had been set up in the town hall, her legs trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She found Sheriff Thompson lying on a cot, his face pale, his body bandaged. He was alive, but his condition was critical. Rhett, Madeline whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Where is he?" The sheriff pointed towards a closed door, his eyes filled with sorrow. "He's in there," he said, his voice weak. "He fought bravely, Madeline. He saved us all." Madeline's heart pounded in her chest. She pushed open the door, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. She saw him.
Rhett.
Lying on a bed, his body still, his face covered in blood and dirt. He looked lifeless. Madeline rushed to his side, her tears flowing freely, her heart shattering into a million pieces.
Rhett.
She cried, her voice a desperate plea. No. Please, no. She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. His skin was cold, his pulse weak. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a crushing sense of loss that threatened to consume her. Suddenly, his fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze focusing on her face. Madeline, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Madeline's heart leaped with a surge of hope. He was alive. He was alive.
Rhett.
She exclaimed, her voice filled with relief and joy. You're alive. Oh, thank God you're alive. He smiled weakly, his blue eyes filled with love and exhaustion. I told you, he whispered. I'd come back. Tears streamed down Madeline's face, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of overwhelming love. She leaned down, kissing him gently, her lips brushing against his. I love you, Rhett Lawson, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I love you so much. And I love you, Madeline Sullivan, he whispered, his voice fading. His eyes closed, his body relaxing. Madeline held him close, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He had faced his final confrontation, had stared death in the face, and had emerged victorious. He had proven his courage, his loyalty, his unwavering love. The horizon, once again stained with the red of a setting sun, was also, once again, fading into the promise of a new day. Their final confrontation had been not with death, but with life. Not with hatred, but with love. And as they stood, together, silhouetted against the fading light, they knew that their journey, though filled with challenges, would always end in the same place. Together, their hearts and their horizons, forever intertwined. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, and they were home. Epilogue. Years passed, painting the landscape of Second Chance Ranch with the gentle hues of time. The harsh lines of the desert softened, the once barren ground bloomed under Madeline's tender care, and the weathered homestead stood as a testament to a love that had endured, a love that had transformed not only their lives but also the heart of Silver Creek. Rhett, his gunfighter days behind him, served as the town's sheriff, his presence a reassuring symbol of justice and peace. He was no longer the haunted, solitary figure Madeline had first encountered. He was a man grounded in love, purpose, and community. His blue eyes, though still holding the echoes of a turbulent past, now sparkled with contentment, with the quiet joy of a life well lived. Madeline, her silver hair braided and often adorned with wildflowers, was the heart of their home, the soul of their ranch. She was known throughout the town for her kindness, her wisdom, and her unwavering spirit. The lines etched on her face were no longer marks of hardship, but rather the map of a life filled with love, laughter, and resilience. Their days followed a familiar rhythm, a comforting routine punctuated by the changing seasons. Mornings began with the aroma of coffee and the sounds of Rhett preparing for his duties in town. Afternoons were spent working on the ranch, tending to the garden, and caring for the animals. Evenings were reserved for quiet conversations on the porch, for sharing stories, dreams, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. They often hosted gatherings, their home filled with the laughter of friends, neighbors, and even Sheriff Thompson, now retired and enjoying a well-deserved rest. The townsfolk, once wary of the former outlaw and the widowed stranger, now embraced them as their own, their story a local legend, a testament to the transformative power of love and second chances. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the golden fields, Rhett and Madeline sat on the porch, their hands clasped together, their shoulders touching. They were older now, their bodies bearing the marks of time, but their love remained as strong, as vibrant, as the day they had first met. Remember that broken wagon wheel? Madeline asked, a soft smile gracing her lips. Rhett chuckled, his blue eyes twinkling with amusement. How could I forget?
He said.
You looked like a wrathful angel, ready to take on the whole desert. Madeline laughed, a warm, melodious sound that echoed through the quiet evening air. And you looked like you'd stepped right out of a dime novel, she retorted playfully. A dangerous gunfighter, with secrets hidden in his eyes. Well, I was a dangerous gunfighter, Rhett said, his voice taking on a mock serious tone. But you saw something more in me. Something I didn't even know was there. Madeline squeezed his hand, her gaze filled with love and gratitude. You had a good heart, Rhett Lawson, she said. It was just buried under a lot of pain and regret. And you helped me dig it out, Rhett said, his voice soft, his gaze unwavering. You gave me a reason to live, a reason to be a better man. They fell silent, their gaze drifting towards the horizon, towards the vast expanse of the star-studded sky. The silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken words, with shared memories, with the quiet certainty of their enduring love. We built a good life, Rhett, Madeline said finally, her voice filled with contentment. Rhett nodded, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, drawing her closer. We did, he said. A life beyond my wildest dreams. They sat there, together, in the quiet stillness of the evening, two souls intertwined, two hearts beating as one. They had faced their demons, conquered their fears, and built a life filled with love, purpose, and the enduring beauty of second chances. The desert, once a symbol of their loneliness and despair, had become their sanctuary, their home, their forever. And as the stars shone brightly above them, reflecting in their aged but loving eyes, they knew their story wasn't just a tale of the West. It was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a testament to love's ability to blossom, even in the most barren of grounds. The end.